The October wind carried a peculiar chill through the stone corridors of Sanctum Dei Convent, cutting through the prayer halls and the dormitories with an almost sentient purpose. Mother Margot Devereaux paused in the library, her 53-year-old hands trembling as she gripped the leather-bound accounts ledger. No, not 53. 43. She had long ago stopped correcting herself on such small deceptions, the one she told herself late at night when insomnia claimed her in her austere cell. 43 years old, and she had spent the last 22 of them behind these convent walls. Her brunette hair, threaded now with silver she hid beneath her coif, had once been the color of chestnuts in autumn. Her dark eyes, sharp and commanding, had once turned heads in drawing rooms in Vienna, before scandal and heartbreak had driven her to this refuge of divine silence. The convent had been her salvation then, a place where a woman of questionable virtue could find redemption through prayer and penance. Yet something had shifted today. Something fundamental had changed within these ancient stone walls. It had begun that morning during prime, the first office of the day. Margot had been leading her sisters in prescribed psalms when she felt it, a presence that seemed to press against the very fabric of the sacred space like a hand pushing through silk. The sensation had been neither cold nor warm, neither entirely real nor wholly imagined. It was a feeling of being watched by something that existed just beyond the veil of her mortal perception. She had dismissed it then, attributing the disturbance to her own restless spirit, to the occasional rebellion of her flesh against the austere demands of her station. But throughout the day, the feeling had only intensified. During the office of sex at midday, the candles had flickered without wind. During nones in the afternoon, she had caught her reflection in the polished silver of a reliquary and seen, for just an instant, a shadow standing behind her that cast no earthly reflection. By vespers, even the youngest of the novices had begun to notice something amiss, their eyes darting nervously around the chapel, their voices faltering during the hymns. Now, as darkness settled over the convent like a shroud, Margot sat alone in the library, surrounded by the wisdom of the church fathers and saints. The books offered her no comfort tonight. St. Augustine's Meditations on Temptation seemed suddenly relevant in ways they never had before. She closed the ledger with more force than necessary and listened to the silence of the convent after Compline, the final office. The other sisters would be in their cells by now, seeking what rest they could find. The stone chambers of Sanctum Dei were arranged in 3 rows around a central courtyard, creating a quiet maze of uniformity and purpose. Margot's cell as Abbess was slightly larger than the others, a privilege that sometimes felt like a punishment. It afforded her more space for prayer and contemplation, but also meant she was more isolated, farther from the communal warmth of her sisters. She made her way through the darkened corridors now, her candle casting dancing shadows on walls that had stood for 4 centuries. The light caught on the stone crucifixes set at regular intervals, and in each one, she fancied she could see something watching her pass. It was foolish. She was a woman of reason and faith, not one given to hysteria or supernatural imaginings. And yet, she could not shake the conviction that something had fundamentally altered the spiritual atmosphere of the convent. When she reached her cell, she paused before the heavy wooden door. The iron latch was cold beneath her fingers, colder than it should have been, even in October. She pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find some explanation for the day's disturbances. The cell was exactly as she had left it that morning. A narrow bed with rough woolen blankets, a small wooden desk where she kept her personal scriptures, a kneeling bench before a simple wooden cross, and a single high window that looked out over the convent gardens. Margot lit the oil lamp that hung from the wall and began to prepare for bed, moving through the familiar rituals of her evening devotions. She knelt at the bench and prayed, though her concentration fractured repeatedly, her mind returning to the strange presence that had haunted the convent all day. When she rose, her knees were stiff, and her prayers fell hollow in her own ears. She was preparing to climb into bed when she became aware that she was no longer alone. There was no sound, no movement to herald the arrival. It was purely a matter of sudden and absolute knowledge, the kind of awareness a prey animal must experience when a predator enters its space. The air itself seemed to change, becoming thicker, heavier, laden with a scent she could not identify. It was neither unpleasant nor entirely pleasant. ancient and rich, like old leather in distant storms, like midnight and mortality. Margot turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the small wooden rosary that hung at her side. Standing in the corner of her cell, where the shadows pooled deepest, was a figure. He was impossibly tall, his silhouette seeming to fill the small space with a presence that made the walls appear to contract. His features were rendered unclear by the insufficient light of the oil lamp, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw, the sharp angle of his cheekbones, the piercing quality of his gaze even in the darkness. His hair was dark as the night itself, and his clothes were entirely black, making him appear almost as an absence of light rather than a presence. Margot should have screamed. Every instinct honed by 22 years of religious devotion screamed at her to cry out, to call upon the sisters, to invoke the names of saints as protection against whatever unholy thing had invaded her sanctuary. Her lips parted, her throat tightened, but she did not scream. "Who are you?" she asked instead, her voice steady despite the wild racing of her heart. "How did you enter this sacred place?" The figure took a step forward, and the light of the lamp caught his features more clearly. He was, she realized with a shock that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a completely different sort of danger, extraordinarily beautiful. His face was the face of a fallen angel, all sharp angles and predatory elegance, with eyes of such a pale gray they were almost silver. When he smiled, she caught the briefest glimpse of something unusual about his teeth, something that made her primitive brain scream warning, even as another, more dangerous part of her found the sight utterly captivating. "I came through the door," he said, his voice low and smooth as aged whiskey. "Your convent defenses are constructed for human threats, Mother Abbess. I am not human." There it was, stated plainly, confirming what some deep part of her had already intuited. The presence she had felt all day suddenly coalesced into understanding. This man, this thing, was the darkness that had permeated the convent since morning. "You are the devil," she said, and it was not quite a question. "No," he replied, taking another step toward her, "though I have served that cause on occasion. I am something older than your devil, something that existed long, before your Christianity taught mankind to fear the night. I am Dmitri Volkov, and I have walked this earth for 473 years. Margot's mind raced, cataloging theological explanations, searching through her extensive religious education for guidance on what one should do when confronted by a supernatural being in one's own bedchamber. "The sacrament," she said, moving toward the small table where she kept a personal Eucharist. "The body of Christ." "Will do nothing to me," Dmitri said, though he made no move to stop her. "I have stood in cathedrals more ancient than your faith, Mother. I have watched civilizations rise and fall. Communion wafers and holy water are mere symbols to one who has transcended such human concerns." "Then why haven't you killed me?" The question emerged before she could consider its wisdom. "If you are what you claim, why have I not already fallen?" He stopped mere feet from her, and she could see now that while his face was beautiful, there was something deeply wrong about him in a way that had nothing to do with the supernatural. His skin was too pale, almost luminescent in the lamplight. His eyes held neither warmth nor compassion, only an ancient, terrible intelligence. And yet, something in his expression suggested not cruelty or hunger, but something far more complex, loneliness. "Because," he said softly, "I did not come to the convent of Sanctum Dei for a nun's blood. I came seeking something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous." "What?" she breathed. "You," he said simply. "I came seeking you, Margot Devereux, daughter of the House of Devereux, once betrothed to the Austrian Count Victor Kellerman. Once, before the scandal that took the lives of 3 men and drove you into hiding behind stone walls and prayer. The shock of being known, truly known, by this creature, this vampire, for that was surely what he was, though the word seemed too simple, too limited for the reality before her, struck Margot harder than any physical blow. She had buried that part of herself so deeply beneath 22 years of penance and devotion that she had almost forgotten it. Almost, but not quite. The memories still came in the darkness before dawn, when her will was weakest. "How do you know of my past?" she demanded, gathering her composure the way she would gather the folds of her habit, arranging her voice to sound commanding when inside she was fracturing. No one knows. The convent took me with no questions asked, and I have never spoken of how 3 men died competing for your affections. Dmitri interrupted, moving past it with a grace that seemed almost impossibly fluid for such a large frame. Of how the court was scandalized by your involvement. Of how you disappeared into this convent at 19 years old, determined to spend the rest of your life atoning for sins that were, by any reasonable measure, not entirely your own. Stop. Her voice was not a plea but command, born of the authority she wielded as Abbess. And remarkably, he did stop, pausing by her small window as if considering the gardens below. Why would you know these things? And why would you come for me now after so many years of safety and peace? He turned back to her, and in the lamplight she could see the traces of something almost human in his ageless features. Something that might have been regret or sorrow, or the ghost of emotions he had long since abandoned. Because, he said, I have spent 473 years searching for a soul worth saving, Margot. I have walked through kingdoms and wars, through centuries of darkness and depravity. I have taken countless lives because it was what the curse demanded. And in all those centuries, I have never encountered a human possessed of such profound, conscious, deliberate goodness as you. You have spent 22 years praying not for yourself, but for others. You have denied every human need and desire in pursuit of something greater. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever encountered. Not because of your face or your body, though both are lovely, but because of the luminosity of your soul. Margot felt something shift within her, some fundamental tectonic movement in the landscape of her carefully ordered spiritual and emotional world. That is precisely why you should leave, she said, but her voice was trembling. If what you say is true, then my soul is all the more precious because it remains unspoiled, corrupted at your peril. I have no intention of corrupting you, he said. I came to corrupt myself, to see if, after 4.5 centuries of darkness, it might be possible to feel something other than hunger and rage and the endless, crushing weight of immortality, to see if, simply by being in your presence, I might remember what it was like to be human, to have hope. She turned away from him, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. Hope is a dangerous thing for creatures such as you, she said softly, and for a woman such as I, in a place such as this. This conversation itself is a transgression I will spend years atoning for. Then let us transgress a little longer, he said. The night is still young, and dawn is many hours away. Let me simply sit in your company, Margot. Let me remember what it was like to feel something other than the void. If you send me away now, I will leave. I will not force myself upon you, or attempt to turn you into something you are not. I will respect the sanctity of your cell and your vows. But I will ask you this one night. Let me have this one night of your presence, and tomorrow I will vanish from your life forever. Every rational thought, every doctrine, every principle Margot had adhered to for more than 2 decades screamed at her to refuse. This was a demon in her cell, a creature of darkness, a being that represented everything her faith warned against. To remain in his presence was to tempt damnation. To continue this conversation was to flirt with spiritual ruin. And yet, as she looked at him, truly looked at him, she saw something in those ancient, impossible eyes that she recognized from her own mirror on her darkest nights. Loneliness, a profound, aching loneliness that had no name because it was so complete, so absolute. You may sit, she said finally, gesturing to the small wooden chair beside her desk. But you will explain to me how such a creature comes to seek salvation in the cell of a nun, and I will listen. But I will not be moved. Dmitri Volkov, no matter how eloquently you speak or how perfectly you understand the longings I have spent my entire adult life denying. He moved toward the chair with that same preternatural grace, folding his impossibly long frame into the small wooden seat, as if it were no small feat of geometry. When he smiled, it was with genuine warmth, and she saw for just an instant the man he had been before the curse had transformed him into something beyond human. Then let me tell you a story, Margot, he said. Let me tell you the night I died, and of the 4.5 centuries I have waited for a dawn that never came. And in the small cell, surrounded by the stone walls of a convent dedicated to divine silence, Margot Devereaux, the Abbess, the penitent, the woman who had sacrificed everything to virtue, settled herself to listen to a vampire's confession, unaware that her entire life was about to transform in ways she could never have imagined. Dmitri began to speak, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had recounted this story many times in the depths of his own mind, rehearsing it endlessly through the long centuries. "I was born in 1552, he said, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the convent walls. "In Moscow, during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. My father was a nobleman, a military commander of some renown. My mother was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. I was their only son, and I was raised with every advantage that wealth and position could provide. I was educated in languages, in philosophy, in the martial arts. I was by all accounts a man destined for greatness." He paused, and Margot realized that even now, after centuries, the memory carried weight for him. "I was also," he continued, "desperately in love with a woman I could never have. She was the wife of a visiting diplomat from France, a woman of extraordinary beauty and wit. I was 24 when I first saw her. She was 39. We spoke for perhaps an hour at a court function, and in that hour, she became the entire world to me. It was, I understand now, what you call infatuation, the passion of a young man for an older woman who represented everything he could not possess." Margot felt something stir within her at these words, a recognition of a feeling she knew too well. "She returned to France," Dmitri said, "and I returned to my life of privilege and purpose. But I could not forget her. I spent months in a state of melancholy that alarmed my family and baffled my friends. I threw myself into military campaigns, into the service of the Tsar, into anything that might distract me from the gnawing emptiness her absence had created. And slowly, over the course of a year, the acute pain of loss began to fade into a dull, constant ache, the sort of pain that becomes part of who you are." He shifted in the chair, and for a moment, Margot caught herself staring at him, at the impossible perfection of his features, at the barely concealed power in every line of his body. "When I was 26, he continued, I met someone in Moscow, a man, pale, refined, with eyes that seemed to hold more years than any human should possess. We became friends. He was traveling through Russia on mysterious business that he refused to explain. We spent many nights together, drinking, gambling, speaking of philosophy and the nature of existence. I confided in him about my love for the French woman. He listened with a gravity that suggested he understood the depth of my suffering in ways that my living friends could not. Dmitri's voice grew quieter, as if the memory itself was drawing him deeper into the past. One night, after we had been drinking heavily, he suggested a solution to my pain. He said there was a way for me to achieve immortality, to live long enough that I might see the woman I loved again in a future life, under different circumstances. He said that if I became as he was, I would transcend the limitations of human weakness and desire. I would become something greater, something that might finally be worthy of the love I sought. He was lying, Margot said softly. Yes, Dmitri agreed, but I was young and desperate and foolish. I agreed to his transformation without fully understanding what I was accepting. That very night, he bit me. I remember the pain, not the pain of his fangs, but the pain of his blood enter my body, beginning to transform every cell, every thought, every fundamental aspect of what it meant to be human. I remember the hunger that came, a hunger so profound and consuming that I forgot my own name. And I remember the first kill, the first time I understood what I had become. He turned to look at her directly, and in his eyes, she saw the reflection of 4 centuries of accumulated grief. He had lied about the immortality being a gift. Dmitri continued. It was a curse. The hunger never ceases, Margot. Never. It is a constant presence, like a second heartbeat, like breathing. You learn to live with it, to manage it, but it never releases its grip on your consciousness. Every human you encounter becomes a potential meal. Every life becomes a calculation of risk and reward. The worst part is that you do not lose your humanity immediately. It fades gradually, century by century, until you look back and cannot remember what it was like to feel genuine joy, to experience true hope, to believe that your existence served any purpose beyond mere survival. Margot felt a wave of compassion rise within her, unbidden and powerful. This creature, for all his supernatural power and terrible immortality, was trapped in a hell that she could scarcely imagine. "Why did you not seek God?" she asked. "Why did you not use your immortality to come to faith, to find redemption?" Dimitri's laugh was bitter. "Because I tried, Margot. Oh, how I tried. I came to a monastery in the 14th century and spent 5 years living among monks, learning their teachings, seeking the salvation your God offers to all beings. But salvation requires remorse, and remorse requires a capacity to feel. The curse strips that from you. I could not genuinely repent because I could not genuinely feel my sins. I experienced them as historical facts, things that had happened to someone I used to be, but I could not access the emotional truth of them. And without that emotional access, there could be no redemption." He stood, moving to the window, to stare out at the convent garden below. "For nearly 500 years, I have been a ghost in human form, Margot. I move through the world, I feed, I survive, but I do not live. I have not lived since the night I was turned. And then 3 months ago I heard of you." Margot stiffened. "How could you have possibly?" "I have spent many decades in Vienna," he interrupted, "building wealth, establishing identities, living a careful, anonymous life among the mortal population. I have connections in high places, people who tell me things, secrets that circulate among the nobility. When you disappeared, when a young noblewoman of significant beauty and considerable scandal vanished into a convent, the story fascinated me because it reminded me of my own experience. A woman destroyed by passion, seeking salvation in sacred walls." He turned back to her. "I began to investigate. I learned of your background, of the men who died, of the scandalous affair that had preceded it. And I learned of your transformation in this convent, of how you had, through sheer force of will and devotion, transformed yourself from a woman of the world into something approaching sainthood. The irony was not lost on me. We are, in many ways, mirrors of each other. While I was trying to become human again, you were trying to transcend your humanity and become something divine." "That is not what I was doing," Margot protested, though even as she spoke, she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. Had she not spent 22 years attempting to kill the woman she had been? Had she not sought to transcend the weakness of her own heart through prayer and penance? "Is it not?" Dimitri asked gently. "Tell me honestly, Margot, in all your years here, have you ever truly forgiven yourself? Or have you simply hidden from yourself, disguising your pain as devotion?" The word struck at something deep within her, at a truth she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She turned away from him, her hands trembling. "I have found peace," she said, though it sounded like a question. "You have found numbness," he corrected, and his tone held no judgment, only observation. "There is a difference. And I came here tonight not to corrupt that peace, but to offer you something different. A choice. Because the moment I arrived at this convent, the moment I walked through its gates and felt the presence of your soul, the first genuine emotion I have felt in decades awakened in me. Not hunger, not the desire to feed or destroy, but something else entirely. Recognition, connection, something that felt, for the first time in 473 years, like hope." Margot turned back to face him, and she could see that his ageless face was transformed by genuine emotion. There were no tears. She suspected he was incapable of producing tears. But there was vulnerability in his expression, a rawness that suggested he was risking something profound in admitting these things to her. "I cannot help you," she said quietly. "Whatever you seek in me, I cannot provide it. I am bound by vows, by devotion, by the life I have chosen." "I know," he said, "and I would not ask you to break those vows. But I am asking you to let me sit with you, to let me remember what it felt like to be human, to let me have this one night where I am not alone in the darkness." He moved toward her, slowly, with absolute respect for her space. "Just a night, Margot, just this one night. And when dawn comes, I will leave. You will never see me again. The convent will be at peace, and you can continue your life exactly as it was before. But give me this, please." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw in that moment not a vampire, not a demon, but a man broken by centuries of isolation, seeking simply to feel less alone. And in that recognition, she felt something crack within her carefully constructed walls. She thought of all the nights she had spent in the cell, praying, seeking connection with God who sometimes felt impossibly distant. She thought of the longing she had buried so deep that she had almost forgotten it existed. She thought of all the ways she had tried to kill the woman she had been, only to discover that woman was still alive, still hungry for connection, still capable of feeling. "You may sit," she said finally, "but we will do nothing that would require confession or additional penance. We will simply talk, and when dawn comes, you will leave." Something that might have been joy flickered across his features. He returned to the chair, and Margot settled onto the edge of her bed, maintaining a careful distance between them. Outside, the October wind continued its ceaseless patrol of the convent walls, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant rain. "Tell me," she said, "of the woman you loved, the one from France. Did you ever see her again?" And so Dmitri began to speak, weaving stories of centuries past, of kingdoms risen and fallen, of love and loss, and the terrible weight of existence that continued long past the point when anyone would choose for it to end. Margot listened, and with each word, she felt the boundaries of her carefully ordered world beginning to shift, to transform, to make room for something she had spent 22 years denying herself. The night deepened around them, and in that darkness, something impossible began to bloom, a connection between a woman seeking redemption and a creature seeking salvation, between a human soul and something that had long ago ceased to be entirely human. They did not touch. They did not need to. The intimacy of confession, of true understanding, of being truly seen by another being who grasped the depths of one's longing. This was more dangerous, more transgressive, more profoundly intimate than any physical act could have been. And Margot knew, with a certainty that was almost like pain, that her life had fundamentally changed the moment Dmitri Volkov walked through her cell door. There would be no going back to the woman she had been before this night. She would spend the rest of her days trying to understand what had transpired in these hours before dawn, trying to reconcile the pious Abbess with the woman who had sat in conversation with a vampire, who had found in his presence not temptation but recognition, not corruption but a strange, terrible form of grace. The long night stretched before them, full of questions unanswered and confessions unfinished. And as the hours passed, Margot found herself beginning to hope, something she had not allowed herself to do since the day she entered the convent walls. That perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a form of redemption she had not yet discovered, not the redemption of denial and penance, but the redemption of acceptance and connection. The kind of redemption that came only when you stopped running from yourself and turned, at last, to face what you had always been. It was sometime after 3 a.m, that deepest part of night when the boundary between day and dream seemed most permeable, when Dmitri asked her about the men. "You never told me their names," he said. "The 3 who died for you." Margot had been speaking of her childhood, of her mother's love of music, of small, safe memories that had nothing to do with scandal or tragedy. The sudden shift to the heart of her greatest shame caused her to freeze mid-breath. "I don't speak of them," she said quietly. "I know," Dmitri replied, "but I think you should. I think carrying their names in silence only compounds your guilt. Tell me, please." She looked at him, at the creature who had just confessed centuries of killing, of consuming lives, of causing incalculable suffering. And somehow, it was precisely this fact that gave her permission to speak. What judgment could he possibly pass on her? What condemnation could he offer that would exceed the condemnation she had leveled at herself? "The first was Victor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man I was betrothed to. He was 47, a count with vast estates and greater pride. My father arranged a match when I was 17. It was considered an excellent arrangement for both families. Victor was a good man in many respects. Kind, educated, generous with his wife and children from a previous marriage. But he had no passion for me beyond the satisfaction of having acquired a beautiful, well-born young bride." She paused, remembering the feeling of his lips against her hand during the engagement ball, the courtly, but empty gesture. The second was Frederick, she continued. He was a visiting diplomat's son, 28 years old, with dark eyes and a way of looking at women that made them feel as though they were the only person in the world. He came to Vienna for the winter season and was introduced to our household. From the moment he saw me, he was obsessed. He wrote me letters. He arranged to encounter me by chance in the gardens, in the drawing room, anywhere he could manage. For the first time in my life, I felt desired, truly desired, not as a prize to be won, but as a person to be cherished. And you responded, Dmitri said, not as a judgment, but as a statement of fact. I did, Margot admitted. I was young and foolish, and had never been taught that I was capable of inspiring real passion. My parents had raised me to be ornamental, to smile and be silent, and fulfill my duty through marriage. But Frederick made me feel alive. He made me feel as though who I was, my thoughts, my observations, my wit, mattered to him. So yes, I responded. I met him in secret. I allowed him liberties that should have been reserved for my betrothed husband. I was not physically unfaithful, but I was unfaithful in every way that mattered. In my heart, in my affections, in my loyalty. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, even after 22 years, even confessing to a vampire. Victor discovered our correspondence, she said. He was wounded, yes, but more than that, he was enraged, not by my feelings for Frederick, but by the affront to his pride. He challenged Frederick to a duel. They fought in a secluded location outside Vienna, witnessed only by their seconds. Victor was a more experienced swordsman, but Frederick was younger, faster. But neither of them anticipated the third man. The third, Dmitri prompted gently. Marcus, Margot said, and the name hung in the air like something toxic. He was a merchant's son, far below my station in every way. He had no right to aspire to anything more than a cordial acquaintance with a woman of my rank. But he had been in love with me since we were children, watching me with quiet devotion from the periphery of every social gathering. When he learned of the duel, when he heard that I was at the center of this conflict between two men of higher status, something in him broke. He came to the location where Victor and Frederick were to fight, armed with a pistol he had no training in using. Margot's hands were shaking now, even though these events had occurred 26 years in the past. He intended to shoot Frederick, to remove the rival he felt was beneath me, she said. But his aim was wild. The shot struck Victor instead, mortally wounding him. In the chaos that followed, Frederick drew a hidden blade and killed Marcus. Whether in rage or in self-defense, I never knew. And Victor, bleeding out on the ground, saw what he believed to be the cause of all this violence. My beauty, my selfishness, my unwillingness to accept my duty to the man she was betrothed to. She turned away from Dmitri, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. With his dying breath, Victor cursed me, she continued. He said that I was a destruction, a poison gift to any man foolish enough to love me. He said that my beauty was a weapon I wielded with careless cruelty. And then he died, and Frederick fled, never to return to Vienna. Marcus was dead on the ground beside my betrothed. And I realized that 3 men were dead because of me, because of my vanity, my weakness, my inability to honor my vows. They were dead because they made choices. Dmitri said, Victor made the choice to challenge Frederick. Frederick made the choice to pursue you. Marcus made the choice to arm himself and intervene. You did not murder them. Didn't I? Margot turned back to him, and there were tears on her face now, something that broke through the careful control she had maintained for over 2 decades. I knew that Frederick's attentions were unwelcome to my betrothed. I knew that pursuing that connection would bring consequences. I did it anyway. I was selfish and thoughtless and cruel, and 3 men paid with their lives for my selfishness. Dmitri was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of genuine wisdom earned through centuries of contemplation. I have watched humans for centuries, he said. I have seen them at their best and their worst. And I have learned that there's a fundamental difference between guilt and responsibility. You were responsible for your actions, for the choices you made about your own heart and affections, but you were not responsible for the deaths that followed. Those deaths came from the violence inherent in the men themselves, from their inability to accept that they could not control you or each other. He leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes intent on hers. "More importantly," he continued, "I have watched you for 3 months before coming to this convent. I have observed the way you treat each sister under your care with infinite patience and compassion. I have seen you nurse the sick, comfort the grieving, teach the ignorant. I have watched you live a life of such profound goodness that it exceeds what most humans accomplish in their entire existence. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that those 3 men would not want you to spend 22 years atoning for their deaths. They would want you to have lived, fully, joyfully, passionately. But I vowed," Margot began. "You vowed to serve God," Dmitri interrupted, "not to destroy yourself. There's a difference between sacrifice and self-annihilation. You have crossed the line from one to the other." The words hung between them, dangerous and liberating in equal measure. Outside, the wind had stilled. The convent was as silent as a tomb, appropriate, Margot thought distantly, for a place dedicated to death and resurrection. "Even if what you say is true," she said carefully, "it changes nothing. I am an abbess. My life is devoted to the church and my sisters. I cannot simply abandon that because a vampire has appeared in my self-spouting philosophy. I am not asking you to abandon it," Dmitri said. "I am asking you to question whether you chose it freely or whether you chose it as punishment. And I am asking you to consider that there might be other forms of devotion, other ways of serving something greater than yourself that do not require you to deny the fundamental truth of your own heart." He stood then and moved to stand directly in front of her. This close, she could see the minute variations in the color of his eyes, silver and gray and something deeper, like starlight filtered through water. "I have spent 4.5 centuries unable to touch anyone," he said. "Unable to form genuine human connection because the hunger eclipsed everything else. Until now, until you." He extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture of offer rather than demand. "I am asking for permission to touch you, Margot. Not in passion, not in lust, but simply to confirm that I am still capable of human connection. Simply to feel, for one moment, that I am not entirely alone." Every vow Margot had ever taken screamed at her to refuse. Every doctrine of the church, every principle of feminine virtue, every societal expectation demanded that she turn away from this creature and call for her sisters. This was the moment of true temptation. Not the seduction of the flesh, but the temptation of connection, of being truly known and accepted by another being, of feeling less profoundly alone in the darkness of existence. She thought of 22 years of prayer that had not healed her. She thought of the numbness she had mistaken for peace. She thought of a woman named Margot who had loved with dangerous passion, who had inspired devotion in men, who had been alive in a way she had not permitted herself to be since entering these walls. She placed her hand in his. The contact was electric. His skin was cold, not merely cool, but genuinely, unnaturally cold, the cold of something that did not have a beating heart, that did not generate the warmth of human life. And yet, it was not unpleasant. It was like touching marble that had been chilled in moonlight. He closed his fingers gently around hers, and she could feel the incredible power contained in his grip, the strength that centuries of predatory existence had granted him. He could crush her hand without effort. Instead, he held it with infinite gentleness. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "This is what I have been missing," he said. "This connection, this ability to touch another being and feel something beyond hunger. This is what I came seeking." They stood that way as the night deepened toward its final hours, their hands clasped between them. It was the most chaste and yet most intimate moment of Margot's adult life. Outside her cell, the convent continued its eternal rhythm of sleep and prayer, the sisters in their cells completely unaware that their abbess was standing in the darkness, holding hands with a vampire, feeling something she had not permitted herself to feel in decades: hope. When he finally released her hand, it was with visible reluctance. "Dawn approaches," he said, though there was no hint of light yet visible through the window. "I must leave soon. The sun and I are not compatible." "When we return?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. This was not the conversation they were supposed to be having. This was not the scenario they had agreed upon. "I will not," he said gently. "I made you a promise. I will leave at dawn and I will not return. You will continue your life as Abbess. You will maintain your vows and your position. And you will have this night, this one perfect, impossible night, to remember that you are capable of connection, of passion, of being loved by something that sees you clearly and accepts what it sees. That is not enough, she said, and was shocked at her own boldness. You cannot appear in my life like this, and then simply vanish as though it were a dream. It is all I can offer you, Dmitri said. Anything else would require me to ask you to sacrifice the life you have built, and I cannot do that. I will not be the reason you lose your position, your community, your faith. So I am offering you this, the memory of connection, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, a creature of darkness sees you not as the woman you have convinced yourself you are, broken, sinful, unworthy, but as the extraordinary being you have always been beneath the layers of penance. He moved toward the window, and as he did, the first hint of gray appeared at the horizon. Dawn was coming. Wait, Margot said. Tell me at least that this was real, that I did not imagine all of this, that you are truly what you claim to be. Dmitri turned back to her, and in the pre-dawn light, she could see that his features were beginning to show the strain of the approaching sun. His skin seemed to grow even paler, more translucent. It was real, he said, and the most real thing I have experienced in 473 years. You are not imagining this, Margot, but when this sun rises, it will feel increasingly like a dream. You will question it. You will wonder if it was a visitation, a temptation, a product of your own isolated mind. And perhaps that is mercy. Perhaps it is better for you to question than to be absolutely certain. He moved toward the door. No, Margot said. There must be something more. There must be a way. There is no way that does not end in your destruction, he said, and for the first time, she heard genuine emotion break through his carefully controlled voice. And I will not destroy you, Margot. I have destroyed too much already. So this is where I leave you. Remember this night. Remember that you are capable of being loved by someone who sees beyond the surface of your beauty to the luminosity of your soul. And remember that somewhere in the world, a creature that has walked in darkness for centuries experienced a moment of light because of you. He opened a heavy wooden door, and the pre-dawn air rushed into the cell, carrying with it the scent of rain and dying leaves. Dmitri, she called. But even as she spoke his name, she realized she could no longer see him clearly. The shadows seemed to have intensified around him, making him appear less like a man and more like darkness given temporary human form. Farewell, Margot Devereaux, she heard his voice say, already distant. Thank you for this gift of your presence. Thank you for letting me remember, for one night, what it felt like to be alive. And then he was gone, dissolving into the pre-dawn shadows like mist dissipating in morning light. Margot stood alone in her cell, her hand still feeling the phantom chill of his touch. She moved to the window and looked out over the convent gardens just as the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, flooding the stone courtyard with golden light. For several long moments, she stood there, questioning her own sanity. Had it truly happened? Could the abbess of Sanctum Day Convent have spent the entire night in conversation with a vampire, have held his hand, have felt something stir within her that was not chaste and holy but deeply, dangerously human? It had the quality of a dream, too vivid, too perfectly structured, too archetypal in its meaning. And yet, she could smell him still, that strange scent of leather and storms. And her hand, where he had held it, retained the memory of his cold, powerful grip. She turned from the window and found, to her shock, that she was smiling, not with the serene expression of a woman at prayer, but with a genuine, unbidden smile of someone who had just experienced something profound and impossible and beautiful. Sister Beatrice knocked on her door less than an hour later, as she did every morning, to remind the abbess that the bell for prime would ring soon. Margot opened the door wearing her habit, her wimple properly arranged, her expression composed. There was nothing about her external appearance that could have suggested anything unusual had occurred during the night. "Are you well, Mother?" Sister Beatrice asked. Her young face creased with concern. "You seem different somehow." "I am well," Margot said, "simply tired. It was a long night." But as she followed her sister to the chapel for morning prayers, Margot found her eyes drifting to the windows where the morning light streamed in, and her hand reaching unconsciously to where Dimitri's had held hers. The prayers felt different today, not empty as they often did, but full of possibility. She found herself praying not for forgiveness, but for wisdom. Wisdom to understand what transpired. Wisdom to move forward with the knowledge that she was capable of being loved. Wisdom to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she had become. In the weeks that followed, Margot found the convent transformed. The dark presence that had so troubled her on that October day had lifted, replaced by something she could only describe as a kind of sanctified peace. Her sisters noticed a change, attributed it to a deepening of her spiritual practice, a new level of grace that had settled over their community. No one suspected that their Abbess had spent a night in close conversation with a creature of darkness, or that she had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Yet she knew the truth, and she carried it with her through the remaining days of her life, a secret more profound than any she had ever confessed. On cold nights, when the wind howled through the corridors of the convent, she would remember the pale eyes that had looked at her with such ancient, aching longing, and she would allow herself to wonder if, somewhere in the darkness beyond the convent walls, a creature of 4.5 centuries was remembering her as well, remembering the one night when it felt, for a brief and shining moment, that he was no longer entirely alone in the darkness. And if her prayers became less about penance and more about gratitude, if her face took on a softness it had not possessed for 22 years, if her eyes began to hold, beneath the piety, a glimmer of the passionate woman she had once been, well, the sisters simply attributed it to the mysterious workings of grace, not understanding that grace had come wearing a vampire's face and speaking with a centuries-old voice that had reminded her that redemption did not require self-destruction, but only the courage to remember who she truly was.